The Red Summer, race riots in dozens of American cities in 1919, including Chicago.
During the summer of 1919, there was a gross level of blood flowing through the streets of over 36 cities in America. Despite how intense this tragic moment of U.S. history was, this memory has been swept under the carpet. In those moments, the rate of unresolved racial discrimination was on the high side. It was a dark moment that wiped away the lives of hundreds of blacks, vandalized the neighborhoods, and left a scar that has been forgotten in the American community. This painful event is now known as the Red Summer of 1919. But why isn't this story being talked about by the American press and historians? The summer of 1919 was not just an incident of racial turbulence, but a day of judgment that exposed America's racial system. It was a terrifying moment that African Americans all over the North to the South were under siege by white mobs, police forces, and even the federal government that intentionally kept mute on the violent situation. In those times, the promise of freedom for the Black Americans was facing intense opposition, fear, resistance, and hatred by the white community. The Red Summer was one of the darkest moments of racial violence and oppression in the history of the United States. This event was a clear, vicious attack against the African Americans that was started as a result of racial tension that has remained unchecked for decades. Although there were some key issues that started the issues that aggravated the situation, like the African American soldiers who returned home from World War I and were denied the rights and respect they had fought for overseas, the Great Migration that saw millions of Black Americans journey north in a search for better opportunities, and the economic competition that instigated fear and opposition between the white citizens and the Black communities. One important point that is worthy of note is that the chaotic attack wasn't just a mistake or a sudden incident, but an organized and coordinated event, just to preserve the reputation of the white government. The violence on the Black community wasn't a result of individual differences, but a systemic propaganda to maintain their racial propaganda. Stick around while we uncover the untold truth behind the Red Summer of 1919, how this attack wasn't a coincidence, but one of their long agenda waiting to be released against the African Americans. We'll also look at what caused the attack, what went on during the incident, and the effect of this sad tale in America today. Let's begin. The Red Summer of 1919 did not just happen out of the blue. To have a good grasp of what led to the violent incident, we will have to take a quick glance at the post-World War I era. African American soldiers had fought valiantly in the war, thinking that their sacrifice and patriotism would give them respect and a good standing in the society. Many even thought that their selfless service to their country would make America repent from its racial injustice. Many even thought that their selfless service to their country would make America repent from its racial injustice. But unfortunately, when these soldiers returned home, they met the same oppressive system they left behind, probably worse. Instead of being welcomed with loads of accolades and praises, they were welcomed in a hostile manner. White Americans became a major threat to the Blacks. The war has brought about economic instability, and post-war inflation aggravated competition for jobs. It gave white veterans who returned from the war feel entitled to job opportunities and positions being occupied by Black individuals. This act gave rise to the racial and economic instability. One major factor that fostered the Red Summer was the mass migration, where a large demographic relocation happened between 1916 and 1919, and moved smoothly into the 1920s. In this period, a humongous number of African Americans left the rural South looking for better jobs and life in the industrial North. Some cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and New York significantly experienced their Black populations. The migration caused a serious racial tension. Many whites in the North were not comfortable with the Blacks coming into their labor landscape, perceiving them as a threat to their economic security. African Americans, who were often given the most inconvenient jobs, lowest wages, and most segregated housing, eventually felt the impact of the economic hardships despite they were at the forefront of the racial inequality. The competition for jobs and economic labor did not affect the factory workers alone. Black Americans were also occupying offices once occupied by white workers before the war, especially in the service industry. This made the whites further furious, as they were afraid those they belittled would likely take their job. The racial oppression by this demographic shift was aggravated due to white employers who used black workers as strikebreakers during labor strikes, inflaming white workers who saw black labor as a threat to union solidarity. Beyond this economic turbulence was an even more treacherous force, the white supremacy. The racial conflict of the Red Summer was caused by a deep-rooted belief in the need to preserve white dominance in every aspect of American life. After the Civil War, Black Americans had made significant progress in education, politics, and economic development, but each of these progresses was faced with severe resistance. The racist propaganda that saturated American media at the time wasn't helping the matter, but worsening it. It was like adding fuel to the fire. Films like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, praised the Ku Klux Klan and portrayed black men as dangerous threats to white women. Newspapers frequently uploaded content that depicted black men as criminals preying on white society. These depictions didn't just come out of the blue. They were carefully scripted narratives that stoked white fears of black empowerment and justified violent oppression of African Americans. In these moments, any atom of black success or self-defense was perceived as an offense to the white authority. African Americans who stood their ground and fought back against racist violence were often labeled as troublemakers, while white mobs were seen as protecting their communities. This deeply engraved belief system made it nearly impossible for African Americans to find justice, as law enforcement and even local governments were involved in the violence. The Red Summer of 1919 was a massive, treacherous conflict that affected the entire nation. It was a racial turbulence that was characterized by bloodshed and conflict over 36 cities in the United States. However, there are three major incidents that occurred due to their scale, brutality, and long-term significance. These are the Chicago Race Riot, the Washington, D.C. riot, and the Elaine Massacre. These incidents were a reaction to the deeply rooted racial hatred that existed at the time, and also the failure of local and federal authorities to protect African American communities. The Chicago Race Riot was one of the brutal and most violent events of the Red Summer. It started on the 27th of July, 1919, on the south side of Chicago, and was intensified by the drowning of Eugene Williams, who was a 17-year-old African American boy. Williams had unintentionally gone into the whites-only section of Lake Michigan while swimming. When the whites who were on the beach observed, they began to throw stones at him. Williams became unconscious and drowned. Instead of the police arresting the whites who did this terrible act, they arrested a black man, which led to a breakout among the African American community. This incident led to a week of brutal violence and conflict between the black and white residents. A group of whites violently roamed around the black neighborhoods, setting homes on fire, looting businesses, and physically inflicting pain on anyone they could find. A large number of black Chicagoans were veterans who fought in World War I, fought back furiously, refusing to let their communities be overrun. For days, the streets were painted with chaos, with both groups engaging in violent clashes. The violence wasn't a coincidence. It was fueled by the long-standing racial tensions in Chicago. The violence wasn't a coincidence. It was fueled by the long-standing racial tensions in Chicago. The Great Migration caused the black population of the city to expand, which aggravated the competition for jobs and housing within the city. Segregation in the city was so severe that black residents were often forced to live in overcrowded and dilapidated areas. White Chicagoans, especially those who recently immigrated, perceived the growing black community as a threat to their economic and social status. When the violence had dissolved, 38 people were found dead, 23 black and 15 white, and over 500 individuals were injured. Thousands of black families became homeless as a significant portion of their neighborhoods were burned to the ground, resulting from the chaos. The police response had been very poor and inadequate, with many officers either standing by or actively getting involved in the violence against black residents. The Chicago Race Riot revealed the deep-rooted racial opposition in the North. African Americans thought they had escaped the worst of Southern racism, unknown to them that they'll face a new kind of racial hostility. The racial violence had also eaten deep into the nation's capital during the Red Summer. In July 1919, Washington, D.C. became another vicious city that was reported in the local media about a series of alleged assaults on white women by black men. White veterans, emboldened by the racist rhetoric circulating in the newspapers, decided to take judgment into their own hands. They formed a cartel and began to roam around the black neighborhoods, seeking revenge for those supposed attacks. These assaults were rarely verified, but the accusations were enough to ignite a firestorm of violence. For several days, a group of whites who were former soldiers caused chaos in the streets of Washington, D.C. They were assaulting any black person they came across. Unlike in other cities, however, African Americans in Washington were better prepared to defend themselves. Several black veterans who had served in World War I were organized to protect their neighborhoods. They were armed with rifles, and they returned fire to make it known that they would not allow the white mischief to attack them without a fight. This act of self-defense was remarkable, as it showcased the courage and determination of black Americans who refused to be victims of racial violence. Regardless of this resistance, the violence continued for almost a week. The federal government that was located a few blocks away did little to intervene. The city's law enforcement were overwhelmed by the intensity of the violence. They were partially involved in the conflict, siding with the white hoodlums. This happened until federal troops were finally deployed, and then the violence began to subside. When the war had ended, a total of 15 people were found dead, 10 white and 5 black, and hundreds were injured. The Washington, D.C. riot was a clear picture that racial violence and inequality wasn't confined to the depth of the South or rural areas, but also could happen in the very heart of the American government. It also revealed the deep racial injustice within the U.S. military and law enforcement. Agencies that ought to protect all citizens, but often stirred up the violence against African Americans. Perhaps the most brutal and devastating incident of the Red Summer took place in the rural town of Elaine, Arkansas. The Elaine Massacre that happened during late September through early October 1919 wasn't just a riot, but a massacre. Unlike the conflict that happened in the urban area, this violence was caused by a labor dispute. Black sharecroppers in Elaine got fed up with working under an exploitive condition. They began to organize and make demands for fair wages for their cotton labor. They formed a union with the intent of negotiating better terms with the white landowners who controlled the region. During the night of September 30th, a group of black sharecroppers came together in a church to have a discussion concerning their labor rights. A group of white men, including local law enforcement, attempted to disrupt the meeting. A couple of shots were fired, and in the midst of the chaos, a white man was killed. This created a spark of violent chain reaction. In a few hours, the local law enforcement, a group of white men and federal troops, approached the town with the goal of quelling the supposed uprising of black farmers. A terrible massacre took place after this scene. White fellows went on a killing mission, hunting down black men, women, and children across the countryside. Entire families were slaughtered, building structures were burned, and anyone associated with the sharecroppers union became a major target. Official estimates of the death toll were not definite. It is believed that it was between 100 and 200 black people that were killed, though some reports place the figures even higher. Only 5 white men lost their lives during the massacre, further showcasing how the violence was against one party. During the aftermath, over 60 black men were arrested and charged with causing violence, despite the fact that they had been the victims of the massacre. 12 of these men were sentenced to death in what was widely known as a sham trial. This lasted until 1923, when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned their convictions in the landmark case Moore versus Dempsey, citing gross violations of due process. The Elaine Massacre shows how the white supremacy functioned not just as a perception, but as a system of government. Black laborers who were exploited under the sharecropping system were violently suppressed the moment they tried to exercise their rights. The massacre sent a grievous notification to Black Americans across the South that any attempt to challenge the racial hierarchy will be met with lethal force. The events of the Red Summer did not unfold in the dark. They were witnessed, documented, and in many cases publicized by the media and government institutions. Rather than acting as forces of justice and peace, both the press and the government partially played significant roles in promoting racial violence, spreading misinformation, and maintaining the status quo of white supremacy. The intensity of the violence was a white-dominated press and media personnel that sensationalized and misrepresented the racial turbulence, promoting hatred through the untrue headlines, racist caricatures, and false reporting. Additionally, positioning blacks as the villains, portraying black communities as unruly mobs and dangerous criminals threatening white order and stability. The widespread compelled many to believe in the stereotype of the violent black man, which had been reinforced by the racist media portrayals in films like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, was echoed in newspapers across the country. Articles also emphasized the need for white citizens to defend themselves against so-called black uprisings and the African American neighborhoods. While mainstream media significantly played a destructive role, the black press served as a critical counterbalance, giving a more truthful account of the Red Summer's events and everything that occurred, and advocating for the rights and dignity of African Americans. Publications like the Chicago Defender, The Crisis, and the New York Age became the voices in telling the real story behind the racial violence. While the media played a role in stirring the violence, the local and federal government were also involved by their inaction or direct participation in the attacks. In many cases, local authorities failed to intervene as white mobs caused havoc on black communities. Police forces, especially in cities like Chicago and Washington, D.C., either remained adamant or actively sided with the white rioters. There are several reports of law enforcement officers turning blind eyes to the destruction of black property and the murder of black citizens while arresting African Americans who tried to defend themselves. While the government was indirectly involved, civil rights organizations like the NAACP stepped into the situation and challenged the racial violence and demanded justice. Under the leadership of personalities like W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, the NAACP started a national campaign to investigate the riots, raise awareness, and push for federal anti-lynching legislation. Johnson, who had traveled to several riot and violent cities, called the Red Summer a war waged by white Americans on black Americans. The NAACP gathered evidence, interviewed survivors, and published reports documenting the systemic nature of the violence. They also attempted to influence Congress to pass the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which aimed to make lynching a federal crime. Although the bill was presented in 1918 and passed by the House of Representatives, it was ultimately blocked in the Senate, resulting from fierce opposition from Southern Democrats. The efforts of the NAACP weren't just legal, but also symbolic. They entered a new phase in the fight for civil rights, one where African Americans had enough and could no longer accept the racial oppression they'd been tolerating for so long. The organization's activism during and after the Red Summer helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century. The Red Summer of 1919 was a tragic incident in American history, yet a large aspect of what happened that summer has been hidden from mainstream historical narratives. While the immediate violence was shocking and deadly, the deeper truths about why the Red Summer occurred and the long-term consequences for race relations, civil rights, and American society have often been given a blind eye. One of the hidden truths about the Red Summer is the role that economic factors played in sparking racial violence. The basic cause of many of the riots was caused by racial hatred. Underlying economic tensions between black and white communities was also a significant driving force that fueled the violence. The Red Summer occurred just after World War I, a period where the economy experienced instability. Black veterans who survived the war hoped to find better job opportunities and increase social status after their service. However, they met a labor market that was already strained by competition between returning white soldiers, black migrants from the Great Migration, and white immigrants. Another hidden truth behind the Red Summer is the extent to which law enforcement and government forces actively took a role in fueling the violence. While much of the violence was attributed to white civilian mobs, local police and even federal troops played a significant role in aggravating the riots. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the Red Summer was the galvanization of Black political and social activism. Rather than being frightened by the violence, African American communities responded with a resilient determination to fight for their civil rights. The Red Summer marked a turning point in the consciousness of Black America, as it became clear that more organized and militant approach to resistance would be required to achieving equality. The legal consequences of the Red Summer had lasting effects on the fight for civil rights. One of the most important legal battles that sprung forth from the Red Summer was the case of Moore versus Dempsey, which resulted from the Elaine Massacre. 12 Black men were unjustly sentenced to death after the massacre in sham trials for allegedly inciting violence, even though they had been defending themselves from white mobs. Shockingly, was the law enforcement agency right to sentence these 12 Blacks for an act of self-defense? What should have been done? I'd like to get your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe for more.